Argentina, located in the heart of South America, is a land of diverse natural landscapes, from the northern plains to the Andes Mountains and southern Patagonia. It witnessed ancient civilizations before the arrival of the Spanish, whose influence is etched into its political and social history. A land of conflict and challenges, from its independence in 1810 through the Peronist era and military coups, to modern democracy after 1983, Argentina tells an ongoing story of the struggle for freedom and power, and the desire for stability and opportunity amidst a complex reality. Welcome to this new video in our series on the history of South American countries. Argentina's history began with early human settlements around 13,000 years ago in the southern Patagonian region, where indigenous groups relied on hunting, gathering, and later simple agriculture. Over time, various tribes emerged, such as the Guarani, developing diverse local cultures. In the late 15th century, the Inca Empire extended its influence into parts of the northwest, controlling trade routes and mineral mines. However, their presence was short-lived as Europeans arrived a few decades later. In 1516, the Spanish explorer Juan Díaz de Solís reached the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, marking the beginning of contact between the indigenous population and the Spanish. In 1536, the Spanish attempted to establish their first settlement on the site of Buenos Aires, but this failed due to resistance from the indigenous people and a lack of supplies. The city was finally re-established in 1580. The region later became part of the Viceroyalty of Peru under the Spanish Empire, and trade was heavily restricted in favor of ports controlled by Lima, leading to widespread smuggling and the growth of a local merchant class. In 1776, Spain established the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata to facilitate the administration and defense of the region, with Buenos Aires as its capital. This Viceroyalty encompassed vast territories that today comprise Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and parts of Bolivia. This decision helped spur trade in the region, particularly in leather and cattle, and Buenos Aires became a major economic center in the southern part of the continent. In 1810, the May Revolution erupted in Buenos Aires, following the weakening of Spanish rule due to wars in Europe. The revolution overthrew the local colonial authority and began the War of Independence. José de San Martín and Manuel Belgrano played prominent roles in leading the revolutionary forces. Belgrano fought significant battles in the north, while San Martín led a daring military campaign across the Andes Mountains to liberate Chile and then Peru from Spanish rule. On July 9, 1816, the Tucumán Congress officially declared the country's independence. But independence did not bring immediate stability. The country descended into a protracted civil war between federalists who desired a federation of autonomous provinces and unionists who favored a strong central government in Buenos Aires. During this period, Governor Juan Manuel de Rosas rose to prominence. He had ruled Buenos Aires province with considerable power since 1829 and dominated Argentine politics for many years. His rule ended with his defeat in 1852 at the hands of General Justo José de Urquiza at the Battle of Caseros, paving the way for the reorganization of the state. In 1853, the Argentine Constitution of 1853 was adopted, establishing a federal system and defining the structure of the modern state. After years of conflict, Buenos Aires finally joined the federation and became the national capital. During the second half of the 19th century, Argentina experienced rapid economic growth, fueled by exports of grain and meat and cattle ranching. Large-scale European immigration also contributed to population growth and the development of cities and infrastructure such as railways and ports. At the same time, the state expanded southward and eastward following military campaigns known as the Desert Conquest, which subjugated vast areas previously controlled by indigenous populations. By the early 20th century, Argentina began to undergo significant political and social changes. In 1912, the Sáenz-Peña Law was passed, establishing secret and compulsory voting for men, thus opening the door to greater participation in political life. As a result, the reformist leader Hipólito Yrigoyen won the 1916 elections, becoming the first president elected through a widely participated democratic process and ushering in a new era in modern Argentine political history. In the 1920s, Argentina maintained its policy of neutrality during World War I, allowing it to export goods to Europe, particularly Great Britain, and to generate substantial profits by extending credit to the warring nations. This neutrality also helped Argentina avoid direct involvement in the conflict, despite the sinking of Argentine ships by Germany, such as the Monte Protego in 1917, which prompted the government to expel the German ambassador and convene conferences of neutral powers. In this political context, new political movements emerged, most notably the radical movement, which advocated social reconciliation and rejected class struggle. Meanwhile, more extreme leftist currents, inspired by European anarchism and communism, also appeared, such as the followers of Giovanni Cipriano, who resorted to violence and bombings to pressure the government, including assassination attempts against Hipólito Yrigoyen and US President Herbert Hoover during his visit to Argentina. In 1922, Yrigoyen was replaced by his aristocratic rival, Marcelo Torquato de Alfieri, who formed a government composed of figures from the traditional ruling classes, marking a shift toward more conservative domestic policies. Simultaneously, nationalist and fascist movements, modelled after the Italian black shirts and inspired by the ideas of Marcelino Menéndez Pelayo and Charles Maurras, emerged, gaining support from prominent military figures and writers such as Leopoldo Lugones and Agustín P. Hosto. With Hipólito Yrigoyen's return to the presidency in 1928, a series of reforms began to strengthen workers' rights. However, the Great Depression of 1929 led to economic decline and soaring unemployment, weakening the government and culminating in a military coup led by José Félix Uriburu in 1930. This ushered in the Decade of Doom, characterized by electoral fraud, the persecution of the opposition, rampant corruption, and a repressive campaign against anarchists and the radical left, including the execution of Severino Di Giovanni. Under the conservative government, Agustín B. Hosto came to power in 1932. He adopted liberal economic policies that favoured the upper classes and allowed for political and industrial corruption. His government also entered into agreements such as the Roca-Runzmann Treaty with Britain to boost beef exports. Economic, social and political crises persisted, leading to growing opposition and a rise in revolutionary and labour movements. In 1943, a military coup overthrew the government, and Juan Perón emerged as a popular leader due to his support for workers and unions, paving the way for his election as president in 1946. Perón founded the Peronist movement, which focused on populism, while his wife, Eva Perón, played a pivotal role in advocating for the poor and working class. His rule saw an expansion of union rights and social programs, but his economic policies and currency inflation, as well as his conflict with the opposition, led to a military coup in 1955 that overthrew him, plunging Argentina into a long period of military coups and political instability, with the conflict between different political currents continuing until the 1960s. In December 1969, social and political tensions in Argentina escalated when more than 20 priests, members of the Third World Priest movement marched to Casa Rosada to protest the planned demolition of villas, demanding that General Juan Carlos Anguita reverse these policies. Simultaneously, Anguita began implementing corporate policies, particularly in Córdoba province under the administration of Carlos Caballero, provoking resistance from labor and union groups. With the spread of political violence from both the far left and the extreme right, the country entered a prolonged period of social and political turmoil, foreshadowing the events of the 1970s. The early 1970s saw a surge in activity from revolutionary and Peronist movements in Argentina. In 1971, the military leadership under Alejandro Llanos attempted to restore democracy amidst ongoing Peronist labor protests, but continued violence and the presence of armed guerrilla groups like the People's Revolutionary Army, PRE, and radical Peronists posed a significant challenge to stability. On March 11, 1973, Argentina held general elections after a hiatus of more than a decade. His former vice president, Héctor Cámpora, was elected president with 49.5% of the vote and assumed office on May 25th, amidst strong popular support from the Peronist Youth and Montoneros movement. His government pursued traditional Peronist economic policies aimed at supporting the domestic market and redistributing wealth, but it faced a rising wave of strikes and social protests due to the global oil crisis that same year. Just weeks later, on June 20, 1973, Juan Perón announced his return to the presidency to a massive public reception at Sisa Airport. However, his arrival coincided with a wave of violence from the far right, resulting in the deaths of dozens and injuries to hundreds of Peronist youth and Montoneros supporters. Cámpora and Vice President Solano Lima resigned on July 13th, and new elections were held. Perón won with 61.85% of the vote and assumed the presidency with his third wife, Isabel Martínez Perón, on October 12, 1973, while far-right factions continued their political violence. Perón died on July 1, 1974, and his wife Isabel took over the presidency. However, she faced immense difficulties due to economic collapse, internal conflicts within the Peronist movement, and escalating acts of terrorism from both left-wing and right-wing groups. On March 24, 1976, Isabel Perón was overthrown in a military coup, ushering in a period of brutal military rule known as Operation Dirty. An estimated 30,000 people disappeared, and political and labor opposition was persecuted in what became known as Operation Condor, which involved mass arrests, enforced disappearances, and systematic torture of dissidents. During this period, Argentina faced a border dispute with Chile over the Beagle Islands. This dispute was ultimately referred to papal arbitration in 1984, following mediation by Cardinal Antonio Samoré to avert a territorial war. The final border was established with Argentina accepting Chile's sovereignty over the islands. This long period of military repression, coupled with mounting popular pressure and economic collapse, culminated in free elections held on October 30, 1983. Raúl Alfonsón, the candidate of the Radical Civic Union, won with 52% of the vote, restoring constitutional rule. During his presidency, a commission investigating enforced disappearances was established, headed by the writer Ernesto Sabato. A peace and friendship treaty was signed with Chile in 1984, setting Argentina on the path to restoring democratic stability after decades of violence and military coups. After Argentina's return to democracy in 1983 with the victory of Raúl Alfonsón, the country began rebuilding its civilian institutions after years of repressive military rule. Alfonson's administration focused on investigating enforced disappearances, strengthening government control over the armed forces, and consolidating democracy while halving corruption in public office. This was achieved despite significant challenges in addressing inherited economic problems and ongoing friction with the military and labor unions. In 1989, Carlos Menem assumed the presidency and launched sweeping structural reforms, including the privatization of industries nationalized by Perón and the adoption of free market policies. He used presidential powers to issue emergency decrees when Congress failed to approve the reforms. Re-elected in 1995, he continued to modernize the economy and open markets to foreign investment, but at the cost of widening social inequality. With the end of the 1990s and the onset of the new financial crisis, Fernando de la Rúa took office in 1999 and implemented an IMF program to reduce government spending and increase revenue. In 2001, the country experienced a severe economic collapse, with the peso losing a quarter of its value and widespread riots erupting. This led to a series of presidential resignations until Eduardo Toalde assumed the interim presidency in January 2002. He gradually restored stability through reform policies that included controlling inflation and modernizing public finances. In 2003, Néstor Kirchner took office and led the country toward a relative economic recovery, restructuring external debt, reducing poverty rates, and achieving an average annual economic growth rate of 8%. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner was re-elected in 2007 and 2011, becoming the first woman to be re-elected president in Latin America. Her administration focused on supporting the working class, combating poverty, and establishing political stability after decades of economic and social crises. In 2015, Mauricio Macri assumed the presidency, reinstating neoliberal policies focused on reducing state intervention, attracting foreign investment, and lowering the fiscal deficit. However, he faced significant challenges, including high inflation, soaring public debt, and waves of social protests stemming from austerity measures. In 2019, Alberto Fernandez, the Justice Party candidate, won the presidency after defeating Macri, restoring the traditional power blocs. His administration confronted profound economic challenges: hyperinflation exceeding 50%, massive external debt, and high rates of poverty and unemployment. It attempted to implement mixed economic policies that included subsidies for the poor and control over key markets. Between 2019 and 2023, Argentina experienced a series of accumulating crises: partial collapses of the peso's value, difficulties in financing external debt, frequent union strikes, popular protests, and shortages of basic goods, leading to persistent political tension between the government and the opposition. By 2023-2026, the country continued to face significant economic challenges, including high inflation, currency volatility, and budget deficits, as the government attempted to bolster stability through social support policies and partial fiscal reforms. Politically, Argentina experienced continued partisan division between the Justice Party and opposition alliances, with youth movements and regional influences playing an increasingly prominent role in economic and social policy. Despite these challenges, Argentina maintained a functioning democracy, while discussions continued regarding the economic and social reforms necessary for achieving sustainable growth and improving living standards. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.